I put up with his excuses for years, but when he stole my money, that was the last straw. Maria sat down to dinner that night, her fork clinking softly against her plate. Jeremy, sitting across from her, didn't look up from his phone, scrolling through job listings for what seemed like the 100th time. His shoulders were slumped, his brow furrowed in concentration, but Maria knew the truth. He hadn't actually applied for a job in weeks. His interest in job hunting had waned, replaced by a seemingly endless cycle of staring at the same listings over and over. "Jeremy," she began, trying to keep her voice calm, "have you applied to anything today?" He looked up briefly, annoyance flashing in his eyes. "I'm looking, aren't I?" Maria sighed, placing her fork down. She had asked him the same question multiple times this week, and it always ended the same way: half-hearted responses and no progress. He had quit his last job over a year ago after a clash with his boss. But it wasn't just the job conflict that had caused him to leave. Jeremy had always struggled to keep a job for long. It wasn't the work itself, but rather his inability to handle the pressure of deadlines, expectations, and authority. "Jeremy, if you want to make any progress, you need to take this more seriously. These part-time jobs aren't going to pay the bills forever," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she feared the tension in the room might crack if she spoke too loudly. He grunted, shoving his phone aside. "I'm doing my best, okay? It's not easy out there." Maria didn't reply immediately. She wanted to say so much more. She wanted to ask him why he couldn't stick with a job, why he wouldn't at least take something part-time if it meant contributing to their household. But the frustration was too much. She'd said it all before, and nothing had changed. The next morning, as Maria was finishing up her work, she received a text from Jeremy. It was brief but alarming. "Dad's retiring, so we're going to Germany to celebrate. I'm borrowing your platinum card to cover the trip. Don't worry, I've got it all under control." Maria felt a tight knot form in her stomach. She had to reread the message twice to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. Her credit card? The one with the high limits and rewards? The one she used for household expenses? It was hers alone, tied to her name and her income. How dare he use it without asking her first? Her fingers trembled as she quickly typed a response. "What do you mean, borrowing my card? You need to ask before you use it. And since when do we have the money for a trip to Germany?" There was no immediate reply. She could already sense the tension building, her mind racing with all the ways this situation could go wrong. Jeremy had never asked for permission to use the credit card before. She had always been the one who made sure bills were paid, kept track of their finances, and managed their spending. She had let him take care of a few minor things in the past, but this was different. Half an hour later, Jeremy called. His voice was unusually upbeat, almost too cheery. "Maria, it's going to be fine. I told them I'd take care of everything. This is a big deal, and I want to show my parents a good time. I'm just borrowing the card for the trip. We'll figure it out later, all right?" He said, his words rushed, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. Maria's heart sank. He sounded like he was trying to justify something, and the more he spoke, the more uneasy she felt. "Jeremy," she said, her voice growing stern, "that credit card is not just for trips. It's for our everyday expenses. You can't just use it for whatever you want. And how are you paying for the rest of the trip?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Jeremy responded. "I'll cover it with my savings," he said, though Maria could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Don't worry about it." But Maria wasn't buying it. She knew Jeremy didn't have the kind of savings to cover a trip like that. She had been patient with him, let him go through his phases. But this was a step too far. As the day wore on, Maria couldn't stop thinking about the credit card. It wasn't just the money, though that was an issue too. It was the complete disregard for her feelings and their finances. The longer she thought about it, the more she realized that Jeremy hadn't changed. He wasn't trying to change. He was stuck in his own world, where nothing was his responsibility. That evening, after finishing dinner alone, Jeremy was still busy with his trip preparations. Maria decided to check her credit card statement. When she pulled up the account online, she felt her heart drop into her stomach. The card that Jeremy had borrowed wasn't just being used. It had already been charged for flights, accommodations, and several other expenses. She quickly called the bank to ask about the card's status. "Is the card still active?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "It's set to expire at the end of the month," the representative informed her. Maria's mind raced. Of course, she had already received a new card. She had forgotten to activate it yet, but it was in her wallet. She could barely hold back her anger. The card Jeremy had taken was going to stop working in just a few days, and he had no idea. When Maria finally confronted Jeremy about the card situation, it didn't go as she had imagined. He was defensive, caught off guard, and surprisingly, didn't seem concerned about the trouble he had caused. "What do you mean, the card won't work?" he asked, his voice tinged with panic when she told him the truth. "You're just trying to stop me from using it." Maria's patience had worn thin. "Jeremy, it's expired. It's in my name. You can't just take it and use it like it's yours. I don't know how many times I have to tell you that you can't keep using my resources without any responsibility." She hung up before he could argue more, feeling the weight of the situation settle around her. This wasn't about the card anymore. It was about everything that had built up over the past year. Jeremy had never taken her seriously. He had never understood the pressure she faced, balancing a demanding job and supporting him. When she spoke to his parents, explaining the situation, they seemed just as concerned as she was, but there was nothing they could do. Jeremy had lied to them, made excuses about his job situation, and avoided taking responsibility. Maria realized then that this wasn't just about a financial mistake. It was a pattern of behavior that had been going on for far too long. The weeks that followed the revelation about the credit card were like a storm in Maria's life, the kind that swirled around her, knocking things over, leaving destruction in its wake. She had spent so long holding on to the hope that things might get better, that Jeremy would somehow change, but now she could no longer deny the truth. The weight of the decision to leave him was heavy, but it was clear to her that staying would mean sacrificing her happiness, her peace, and her future. The realization was terrifying, and yet there was a certain relief in it too. She no longer had to pretend everything was fine. One evening, as the sun dipped low into the horizon, painting the room in soft, warm colors, Maria sat at the kitchen table with her lawyer. She felt an odd sense of calm as she listened to the legal jargon about divorce proceedings. It was a world she had never imagined herself in, but the comfort of knowing she was finally taking control of her own destiny soothed her. Jeremy, of course, was still in denial. He hadn't yet fully processed the situation, continuing to make excuses and avoid any real conversation about their future. It was as though he believed he could simply skate by, continue to live in his detached bubble, with no consequences for his actions. "You don't have to make this decision right now, Maria," her lawyer said gently, sensing her hesitation. "But when you're ready, we'll proceed with filing." She nodded. "I'm ready. It's time." The day after she signed the paperwork, Maria felt like she was walking through a fog. She had spent years in a relationship where she was constantly waiting for things to change, for Jeremy to become the partner she had hoped for. But now, with the divorce papers officially filed, she was facing a future that was uncertain, and it felt both daunting and liberating. Her friends, some of whom had known Jeremy for years, were supportive but shocked. They didn't fully understand, and some whispered their doubts about her decision. "Are you sure you want to do this? Maybe it's just a rough patch," they would say, looking at her with concern. But Maria knew better. She had already spent so many years sacrificing her own needs for the sake of someone who never truly cared about her in the way she needed. In the weeks that followed, she began the process of sorting through their things. Jeremy's belongings were scattered throughout the house. An old guitar he hadn't played in years, his clothes still hanging in the closet, the books he had abandoned. Each item felt like a symbol of a life that was no longer hers, and she was determined to erase the traces of him. As Maria moved his things into boxes, she found herself experiencing a wave of emotions: grief, anger, relief, and even a sense of fear. But it wasn't all negative. There were moments of clarity as well, moments when she realized she was no longer bound by his expectations or his failures. She spent her evenings at home alone, rediscovering the quiet of her space, taking long walks, and slowly rebuilding her sense of self. The woman she had lost in her marriage was starting to emerge again, and though it was painful, it was also necessary. Maria took a few days off work to give herself the time and space to breathe. She wasn't sure where to begin or what to focus on, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the shadow of her past relationship. The divorce had left a mark on her, but it was also an opportunity to reclaim her life. She started with her career. For years, she had been stuck in a job that barely paid enough to cover the bills. She had poured so much energy into keeping the household together, into trying to fix Jeremy's problems, that her own career aspirations had fallen to the wayside. But now, with her renewed sense of independence, she found herself looking at the possibilities ahead. One evening, after scanning job listings, Maria came across an opening for a project manager position at a tech firm. It was a long shot, a role she hadn't considered before, but something about it caught her eye. She took a deep breath and clicked apply. The next day, her phone buzzed with a notification from the company's HR department. They had reviewed her resume and wanted to schedule an interview. Maria's heart raced. The excitement was fleeting, followed quickly by self-doubt. Could she really step into this new role? What if she wasn't good enough? But instead of letting the doubts take over, she pushed them aside. This was her opportunity to step up, to prove to herself that she was capable of more than just being the person who cleaned up after everyone else's mess. She had worked hard in her previous roles and knew she had the skills to succeed. Now was the time to believe in herself. The interview came and went. It was intense and nerve-wracking, but Maria felt a sense of pride afterward. She had done her best, and whether or not she got the job, she was proud of taking that step. It was late one evening, and Maria was making dinner when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, expecting it to be a reminder for an appointment or perhaps a call from a friend. But when she answered, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Hello, is this Maria?" the woman asked. "This is Emily from TechWave. I'm calling to let you know that we'd like to offer you the project manager position." Maria blinked, momentarily frozen. Her breath caught in her throat. "Wait, really?" "Yes, really. We were impressed with your experience, and we believe you're a great fit for our team." A laugh bubbled up from her chest before she could stop it. She was elated. This was the first real breakthrough in her new life. She hadn't expected to get the job, but here it was, right in front of her. After hanging up, Maria stood in the kitchen, taking a deep breath as tears welled up in her eyes. She had made it. This was her moment. The days after the call felt like a whirlwind. Maria finalized her divorce with a sense of finality that brought both relief and pain. The legal battles weren't over, but now with a new job lined up and her independence growing by the day, she felt like she was moving forward. Her first day at TechWave was a blur of new faces and information. It was challenging, but it felt good to be busy with something that was all her own. She wasn't just a wife or a caretaker anymore. She was Maria, a professional, carving her own path. Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, when she was alone in her apartment, Maria would find herself questioning whether she had made the right decision. Was she strong enough to navigate the world on her own? Could she build a life from the ground up, after so many years of living for someone else? But in those moments of fear, she reminded herself that she was capable. She had survived the hardest part. She had taken back her power. And as the weeks passed, Maria started to find herself again. She reconnected with old friends, spent time with her family, and began to rediscover the woman she had once been before Jeremy's influence had taken hold of her life. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Maria was excited to see where it would take her. As weeks turned into months, Maria settled into her new routine. Work at TechWave was challenging but rewarding. Every day, she faced new problems to solve, new tasks to manage. At times, it felt like she was learning a new language, jargon, processes, systems. But with every passing day, she grew more comfortable, more confident in her role. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. She found herself staying late at the office, often losing track of time as she dug into her projects, her mind sharp, her focus unwavering. It was the first time in years that she felt this level of engagement with her work, this sense of purpose. Outside of work, Maria began to find her rhythm again. She reconnected with old friends she had pushed away during the years with Jeremy, spending evenings laughing over glasses of wine, reminiscing about the carefree days before life had gotten so complicated. Slowly, those deep connections she had once cherished were restored. On weekends, Maria started taking long hikes, enjoying the peace of nature. It was a form of therapy, a quiet escape where she could clear her head and gather her thoughts. She had started running too, something she hadn't done in years, feeling the wind against her face as she pushed herself to go further each time. It was about proving to herself that she was stronger than the pain she had endured. Still, there were moments when the loneliness crept in. On quiet nights, when the world was still, Maria would lie awake, thoughts swirling. She missed the companionship, the intimacy, but she knew deep down that she wasn't ready for a new relationship. She wasn't sure she'd ever be. She needed to focus on herself first, to rebuild the parts of her that had been broken by years of emotional neglect. One evening, after a long day at work, Maria stopped by a local cafe for a coffee before heading home. As she sat at the window, sipping her drink, lost in thought, she noticed someone across the room. A man reading a book. Their eyes met for a split second, and he smiled. Something in that brief exchange caught her attention, and before she could look away, he stood up and walked toward her. He had an easy confidence about him, the kind of demeanor that suggested he had no pretensions, no hidden agendas. "Hi," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help but notice you. You looked familiar. Do we know each other?" Maria smiled back, her initial hesitation giving way to curiosity. "I don't think so, I remember. Maybe I'm just one of those faces you see around. I come here often," he explained. "My name's Daniel, by the way." "Maria." They exchanged pleasantries, and as the conversation flowed effortlessly, Maria found herself at ease. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about her past, about Jeremy. She was just present, enjoying the connection with this stranger who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know her. They talked about books, their favorite cafes, the weather. It was light, casual, but there was a spark of something between them, a quiet understanding. As they parted ways, Daniel smiled again, and Maria felt a strange warmth in her chest. "Maybe I'll see you again," he said with a wink. "Maybe," Maria replied, feeling a flicker of excitement. Maria didn't expect to see Daniel again, but a few weeks later, as she walked into the cafe, there he was, sitting at the same table, engrossed in his book. He looked up when she entered, and his face lit up. "Maria," he said with a smile, as though he had been waiting for her. "I didn't think you'd actually come back." Maria laughed, a little shy but intrigued by the warmth in his tone. "I guess I was just waiting for the right moment." They spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing: work, travel, dreams, and the random moments of life that made it all interesting. For the first time in a while, Maria felt like she was connecting with someone on a level that went beyond superficial small talk. She felt seen, heard, and appreciated. Daniel wasn't pushy. He wasn't trying to fix her or save her. He was just there, and that made all the difference. As Maria's connection with Daniel deepened, so did her internal conflict. She wasn't ready to date, wasn't sure she ever wanted to again. She had spent years with someone who had never truly seen her for who she was. The idea of opening herself up to someone new was both exciting and terrifying. She began to question whether she was just afraid of repeating her past mistakes. What if she chose the wrong person again? What if her history of bad choices followed her like a shadow? But over time, Daniel proved to be different. He was patient, understanding, and completely non-judgmental. He never asked too much, never pushed her into something she wasn't ready for. Slowly, he began to show her what real respect looked like in a relationship, one that didn't require sacrifices or compromises of who she was. Still, the walls Maria had built were thick, and they didn't come down easily. On a quiet evening, when they were walking through the park together, she finally opened up about her past. "I don't want to repeat the mistakes I made before," she admitted, her voice shaky. "With Jeremy, I gave everything. I lost myself, and I can't do that again. I don't know if I can ever trust someone the way I trusted him." Daniel listened, nodding thoughtfully. "I get it, Maria. Trust isn't something you can just give away. But it's not about trusting me. It's about trusting yourself again. You're stronger than you know." Months passed, and Maria found herself beginning to trust Daniel in small, meaningful ways. She began to let him into her life, slowly, cautiously, but steadily. She still wasn't sure about where their relationship was going. But for the first time in a long while, she was open to the possibility. Maria had learned to take life one day at a time. She had faced the demons of her past, and though they would never fully disappear, they no longer controlled her. She had learned to stand on her own 2 feet, and now with Daniel, she was learning to walk beside someone again, on her own terms. But the road to healing wasn't linear. There were still days when doubt crept in, when fear and insecurities rose to the surface. But each day, Maria became a little more sure of herself, a little more comfortable in her own skin. As she looked out at the world, At the life she was building, she knew that the journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead. Life always had its twists and turns. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next. As the months rolled by, Maria's life began to feel more balanced. Work at TechWave was going smoothly, and her weekends were filled with peaceful hikes and time spent with friends. But despite all the progress, the past still lingered. It wasn't that she missed Jeremy. It was that the scars he left still haunted her at times. One afternoon she received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Jeremy's. She stared at the envelope for a long time, her breath shallow as her mind raced. She hadn't heard from him since the breakup, hadn't even thought about him for months. But here it was. Her heart pounded as she carefully opened the letter, half expecting it to be some sort of apology or plea for reconciliation. But as she read, she realized it was something entirely different. Jeremy was apologizing, yes, but not for the reasons Maria had expected. He wasn't asking for forgiveness for what he had done to her. Instead, he was apologizing for never truly being there for her, for never seeing her for who she was. He confessed to his own struggles, the things he had been too scared to admit when they were together. Maria let out a shaky breath. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her chest as memories of their time together flooded back. The love that once seemed so real now felt like a distant echo. She realized that, in some ways, she had been waiting for this letter, not for reconciliation, but for closure. It wasn't easy, but she wrote him a letter in return. She thanked him for his apology, but she also made it clear that she had moved on. That chapter was closed, and she was no longer looking for answers. She didn't need him to be the man she once hoped he would be. She needed to be the woman she was becoming. Maria's relationship with Daniel had evolved in ways she hadn't anticipated. They were no longer just two people meeting casually over coffee. They were becoming something more, something deeper. One evening, after a quiet dinner at a small bistro, Daniel took Maria's hand. His gaze was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking a lot," Daniel began, his voice soft. "About us. About how much I care for you. I know things between us haven't always been easy, and I understand that you need time." Maria felt a flutter in her chest. She had grown fond of Daniel, had started to trust him, but hearing him speak so openly about his feelings caught her off guard. "I care for you too," Maria replied, her voice calm but filled with warmth. "I'm just not sure what I'm ready for. I've been through a lot, Daniel, and I'm still figuring out what love looks like for me now." Daniel nodded, his fingers gently tracing the back of her hand. "I'm not asking you to rush. I just want you to know that I'm here. Whatever pace you need, I'll be here." Maria smiled, feeling the weight of his words sink in. It wasn't about rushing or making any grand declarations. It was about understanding, respect, and patience. And for the first time in a long time, Maria felt that with him. She felt safe. As the year drew to a close, Maria found herself rediscovering the simple joys of life. She took up painting again, something she hadn't done in years. The act of creating something from a blank canvas helped her reconnect with her inner peace. It was a way to express the emotions she hadn't known how to speak.